Oh, hello. Whistle-stop guide to the main characters, tick. In-depth guide including quotations you can use in your exam to some of the key themes, including love, hate, parents, children, religion and fate, tick. Close focus on some of the key language devices used in the play, including imagery, personification, antitheses, oxymorons and other rhetorical devices, tick. Regular tips and information about the context, tick. Sample response to a past GCSE AQA examination question, including analysis of how this response meets the mark scheme, tick. It's going to be incredibly useful. Stay tuned. This is Schofield on Shakespeare.
Each section is coloured as shown on screen to help you toggle straight to the section of particular interest to you. You can skip straight to the sections using the hyperlinked timings within the video information section. There are so many resources out there on the characters that my intention is to be savagely brief, to the point, hopefully to give a slightly different perspective. I will aim to use one word to sum up each character, possibly doomed to failure, but at least this can serve as a basis for further discussion and debate. Let's start with Romeo. Unlucky. Unlucky because when he falls so crushingly in love, it is with probably the only girl he is forbidden to be in love with, Juliet, the daughter of his family's bitter enemies, the Capulets. Unlucky because even when he tries his utmost to placate Tybalt in Act 3, Scene 1, his intervention results in his good friend Mercutio's death. Unlucky because his loved one's father is such an impulsive bully, calling for a ridiculously quick marriage between Juliet and Paris, superficially just because the former has seemed pale and upset following Tybalt's death. Unlucky because he has sufficient money, 40 ducats, to bribe the apothecary to give him poison in Act 5, Scene 1. Unlucky because Friar John is unable to deliver him a letter revealing Friar Lawrence's ludicrously elaborate plan, thus meaning that he erroneously thinks his beautiful wife is dead. And unlucky because standing by Juliet's actually alive body, his timing means that he kills himself just minutes before she reawakens to actual living. Juliet. Brave? Brave because at the age of 13, living within a patriarchal world in which daughters were regarded as possessions and sons and daughters were expected to be obedient to their parents' will, particularly their fathers, she dares to kiss a stranger at a family party and pass comment on the kiss. Brave because when overheard by Romeo revealing her innermost feelings and desires in Act 2, Scene 1, she has the integrity to admit she has weakened her position. After all, what man likes a woman to make the wooing process too easy for him? Brave because she appears willing to embrace her own sexuality. Brave because she consummates her relationship with a man she has very recently discovered has killed. Brave because she agrees to an extraordinary plan which is likely to see her locked in and conscious in amongst skulls and decomposing bodies. And brave because, unlike her husband, she has to summon up extraordinary physical strength and courage to stab herself. Those, of course, are our two main characters. Let's speed up yet further to go through some of the other ones. Capulet. Pathetic. Pathetic because his words in Act 1, Scene 1 and 5 imply that he can't come to terms with his advancing years and is desperately trying to cling on to his youth. Pathetic because he has to resort to abuse in order to regain temporary but ultimately self-defeating control over both Tybalt and Juliet. And pathetic because when he thinks Juliet is dead in Act 4, Scene 5, some of his words could be interpreted as mourning the failure of his chosen one Paris to take his daughter's virginity, rather than mourning her for herself. The nurse, Witterer. A Witterer in Act 1, Scene 3, when she digresses to reference her dead daughter Susan, tactics for weaning and, in poor taste for a modern audience, quotes her dead husband's words to a young child foretelling future sexual participation. A Witterer in Act 2, Scene 4, when in conversation with Romeo she rails against Mercutio's sauciness and regularly goes off on tangents, including referring to Paris's good qualities and admiration for Juliet. A Witterer in Act 2, Scene 5, when she keeps poor Juliet hanging before revealing that Romeo has indeed arranged their also hasty marriage. And a betraying Witterer in Act 3, Scene 5, when she brazenly advises Juliet to commit bigamy, leaving the teenager she seems to be devoted to utterly alone and frightened. Friar Lawrence, weak. Weak because in Act 2, Scene 3, he gives in to Romeo's pleas to marry him to Juliet, in spite of clear evidence that the hatred between the two families is toxic and irreparable. Weak because he professes he knows that such violent rush love is likely to have violent ends, yet goes ahead with the marriage ceremony between the pair regardless. And most of all, weak in Act 5, Scene 3, when he disgracefully abandons Juliet to commit suicide. And remember, in Elizabethan times, suicide was condemned by the church as against God's will, and suicides were believed to go straight to hell, declaring that I dare no longer stay. Mercutio, exuberant. Exuberant because in Act 1, Scene 4, he transports his close depressed friend Romeo on an extraordinary verbal flight of fancy, in which he describes in detail a tiny fairy's midwife drawn by a team of minuscule creatures. This fairy midwife travels over men's noses as they lie asleep, implanting and influencing dreams. Exuberance because in Act 2, Scene 1, he delights the coarser members of the Elizabethan and modern audience with sexual quip after sexual quip, including this naughty avowal. Oh, that she were an open arse, thou a popper and pear. Break down the apparent type of fruit into 3 syllables. Pop her in, then you have a clearer idea of debauched meaning. And exuberant because even when dying in Act 3, Scene 1, he still has the strength to conjure up a darkly comic pun when he says, "Ask for me tomorrow, and you shall find me a grave man." Poor Mercutio will not only be in a seriously bad situation, but literally in a grave, due to Tybalt's explosive need to unleash testosterone-fueled violence. From whistle-stop thoughts on the main characters, let's move on to the key themes. Number 1, love and hate, or love versus hate. Love and hate are closely interlinked within the play, most obviously shown in Juliet's concise dilemma summarising phrase from Act 1, Scene 5. My only love sprung from my only hate, too early seen unknown, and known too late. Shakespeare's use of antithesis emphasises the instant tragedy of the situation that has just emerged. Juliet feels that Romeo is the only man she has loved and will ever love, yet he is part of the only family which she has hated and probably will ever hate. And indeed, throughout the play, the hatred between the two families places a permanent shadow over the pair's also brief relationship and marriage. As well as using antithesis in the example already given, Shakespeare deliberately juxtaposes moments of intense hatred next to those of passionate love. The most obvious example of this is in Act 1, Scene 5. Tybalt has spotted Romeo's usurping, uninvited attendance at his family's gala ball, and attempts unsuccessfully to persuade his uncle Capulet to let him challenge the hated intruder. Following his failure, he stews, I will withdraw, but this intrusion shall, now seeming sweet, convert to bitterest gall. The very next line sees Romeo kick off the famous shared love sonnet with Juliet, laced with tender religious imagery. If I profane with my unworthiest hand this holy shrine, the gentle sin is this. The effect of this juxtaposition of extremes is to create dramatic tension on stage and to continually remind the audience that the formation of any relationship between Romeo and Juliet is likely to be doomed, as revealed beforehand in the prologue, and result in considerable peril to all involved. On paper, these lines run consecutively. In the theatre, in order to give the impression of realism, Tybalt and Romeo and Juliet must be placed in different areas of the stage. However love-struck he may have become, Romeo is hardly likely to issue tender, coaxing words of love, with Tybalt literally standing next to him. Nonetheless, Shakespeare's use of language here, in particular the shared use of contrast, further emphasises the play's persistent intermingling of love and hate. Tybalt uses antithesis to confirm how Romeo may feel that his gate-crashing has been extraordinarily agreeable, sweet, but he intends to make damn sure that over time he is left with feelings of bitterest gall. In a very similar way, in his second line, and regularly afterwards, Romeo uses a specific type of antithesis, an oxymoron, when he uses the words gentle sin. This contradictory phrase suggests that wanting to kiss Juliet on sight may be unconventional and against the usual codes endorsed by the Christian Church. Nonetheless, this must be tempered by the fact his desire to kiss stems from feelings of devotion and respect, hence the adjective gentle. Thus, the similarity in rhetorical language used by Tybalt and Romeo, albeit for very different purposes, symbolises the start of a cycle which is seen throughout the play, in which even the most passionate and genuine declarations of love are overshadowed by the looming adjacent presence of the most intense feelings of hatred. Other notable juxtapositions in the play of love and hate, or in this case hate and love, include the end of Act 3, Scene 1 and Act 3, Scene 2. Act 3, Scene 1 has seen the calamitous intervention of Romeo against the sword-fighting Tybalt and Mercutio, leading to first Mercutio's death and then Tybalt's. Following Lady Capulet's particularly strong calls for revenge, justice, Act 3, Scene 1 ends with the prince exiling Romeo and stressing that if he is found in Verona, he must be killed. This is further justified by the final line, "Mercy but murders, pardoning those that kill." So if we forgive those that murder, then ultimately you are paving the way towards or giving mercy to further murders. The very next line of the play switches to Juliet, who, in a gloriously erotic soliloquy, is desperate for Romeo to return so that they can consummate their relationship. She smoulders, "Gallop apace, you fiery-footed steeds, towards Phoebus' lodging." This imagery refers to the horses drawing the chariot of Phoebus Apollo, the sun god. She is desperate for the sun to set quicker, so that her night of passionate lovemaking can begin. Of course, at this point, she doesn't realise that her husband is now a killer. Hatred into love. Stern statements about banishment into expressions of desire. The juxtapositions of love and hate continue even until the final scene of the play. Romeo has gone to Verona to pay his respects to the dead Juliet and hopes to be able to lovingly address her body for one final time before imbibing poison. Just as he opens the tomb, he encounters Paris, who bombards him with a stream of invective, including, "Stop thy unhallowed toil, vile Montague! Can vengeance be pursued further than death?" Paris erroneously thinks that this young Montague has come to indulge in an orgy of further retribution against dead Capulets, perhaps thinking that killing Tybalt for his slaying of Mercutio wasn't sufficient vengeance. Romeo tries to placate him, as he did initially with the fiery Tybalt in Act 3, Scene 1, but is unsuccessful, and the net result is another fight and yet another death. All when Romeo's initial intention had simply been to devotedly express words of love, and to be left alone to die with his Juliet. Overall, these juxtapositions of love and hate result in compelling drama, as we oscillate between one extreme emotion to another, and this is accentuated by Shakespeare's use of dramatic irony, in which the audience know more than one or more of the characters on stage. When two strangers fall in love in Act 1, Scene 5, the audience already know that their families loathe each other, meaning that excitement tinged with foreboding builds in the audience with every loving line. how will Romeo and Juliet respond when they find out that the other is from their famously opposed enemy's family? Similarly, in Act 3, Scene 5, the audience watch Romeo and Juliet's tender morning after words and caresses, fresh with the knowledge from Act 3, Scene 4 that Capulet has arranged to marry Juliet to Paris in just a few days. Such dramatic irony injects the proceedings with a sharp poignancy, as the audience has to conclude that such loving scenes are likely to be tragically short-lived and perhaps never to be repeated. But Shakespeare does not just deal with the extremes of passionate love and passionate hate. He also probes the nature of love itself. What does it mean to be in love? And just because a character says he or she is in love doesn't mean that it's true. Take Paris, for example. It is Act 5, Scene 3, and he is by Juliet's tomb, armed with flowers to scatter. Hearing a noise, he wonders indignantly, "What cursed foot wanders this way tonight to cross my obsequies and true love's rites?" Obsequies are funeral observances, which Paris plans ritualistically to observe every night, at least for the time being. This is certainly a decent laudable gesture from a man towards his fiancée, albeit one whom in the text, although not Baz Luhrmann's famous film in which Paris grins moronically wearing a spacesuit whilst dancing with Juliet at the Capulet ball, is seen only speaking to her once, by chance, at Friar Lawrence's cell. In this conversation, Paris may use terms of endearment, love and poor soul when addressing her, but his stressing of the compulsory nature of their marriage suggests that he may take after his father-in-law than her actual husband in his desire to control and dominate. But my point is this: how can we possibly take Paris's claim of true love seriously, given the almost total lack of contact between them in the play? Shakespeare seems to be suggesting that, particularly in death, humans can enjoy wallowing and deluding themselves about the natures of past relationships, and relationships absolutely must be in inverted commas. He is showing that humans, instinctively perhaps, want to feel that they are in love, want to feel that they have this magnetic, precious connection with another human being. And this is seen not just in Paris at the end of the play, but in Romeo himself at the beginning. In Act 1, Scene 1, his cliched, limp references to Cupid say nothing whatsoever about the woman he supposedly adores, Rosaline, but more that he's enjoying presenting himself as a cruelly frustrated lover. He tells Benvolio, "She'll not be hit with Cupid's arrow. She hath Dian's wit, and in strong proof of chastity well armed, from love's weak childish bow she lives uncharmed." Cupid is the god of love, traditionally shown as a chubby, blindfolded boy ready to shoot arrows which will make humans fall in love. Diana is the goddess of chastity. On one level, Romeo means that Rosaline is impervious to Cupid's arrows, his lustful courting, because she is as ingenious and resourceful as the goddess of chastity herself in repelling male enemy attack. However, in Shakespeare's time, wit could also be used to mean vagina. And so on another level, Romeo's use of imagery descends into a crude, matey suggestion that his supposed loved one has a vagina which is literally impossible to crack. When comparing such cliched tired references to Romeo's stunned, reverent religious imagery when faced with Juliet for the first time, it is clear that his feelings of love for Rosaline was simply the product of testosterone-fueled immaturity. So Romeo and Juliet isn't just about the world's most famous lovers from the world's most famously opposed families. It is also about the temptation for so many of us to delude ourselves about love and being in love, and the glorious opportunities for extravagant imagery and melodramatic, moody, solitary hours for those who decide that they have indeed been hit by Cupid's arrow.
From an exploration of the theme of love and hate to that of young versus old, or parents versus children. In many of his plays, Shakespeare certainly presents parents who expect to be obeyed and get very cross when they are not.
but perhaps his presentation is slightly more nuanced than the language and events of Act 3, Scene 5, in which Capulet furiously attacks Juliet for her refusal to marry Tybalt at once, might suggest. Rewind to Act 1, Scene 2, and here Shakespeare suggests that during periods of calm and relative inertia, parents may be capable of being reasonable and balanced. One of the interesting changes Shakespeare makes to his key source text, Brooke's 1562 English translation of the poem Romeo and Juliet, is to reduce the age of Juliet from 16 to 13. Thus, quite rightly, when Paris asks Capulet whether he would support a potential courtship, the latter comes across as protective and measured. My child is yet a stranger in the world. She have not seen the change of 14 years. Let 2 more summers wither in their pride, ere we may think her ripe to be a bride. Capulet believes that his daughter, whom he affectionately refers to as my child, has not had sufficient experience of life to marry yet. Additionally, his suggestion that she may not be ripe enough to marry may indicate that Juliet still needs time to physically mature and grow. Just as a banana, say, should not be eaten whilst green or unripe, so a girl should not be shunted into the demands of being a wife and mother while still in adolescence. As confirmed within the Cambridge Student Guide to Romeo and Juliet, an Elizabethan audience, like its modern counterparts, would have been shocked at a girl as young as 13 being considered for marriage. She would seem very young to an Elizabethan audience, certainly far too young to marry. In the 1590s, men and women usually married in their mid to late 20s. To marry younger than 20 was uncommon, whatever the social status of the partners. Even among the poor, some degree of economic security was expected, at least for the male. The fact that, in Act 1, Scene 2, Capulet follows Elizabethan convention in declaring that 13 is a little premature for considering marriage makes him seem reasonable. In this scene, Capulet also seems moderately considerate. He instructs the panting Paris, "But woo her, gentle Paris, get her heart. My will to her consent is but a part." The implication is clear. Negotiating a future marriage is a collaborative affair in which agreement is required between all parties, prospective father-in-law, wife and husband. Notice at this stage the fluency of Capulet's language. The words scan perfectly within the iambic pentameter structure. Woo her, gentle Paris, get her heart, my will to her consent is but a part. Note also the rhyming couplet, in which consideration for feelings and the importance of collaboration are emphasised through the end rhymes of heart and part. However, such calm level-headedness is not seen again in the play, and a return to Act 3, Scene 5 seems to indicate that, if we take Capulet as a reasonably typical parent, although fathers may occasionally pay lip service to ideas of equality and rights to a degree of self-determination, ultimately nothing is more important to them than power and public authority. In Act 3, Scene 5, a note that this is the scene that begins with Romeo and Juliet ecstatically in bed together. There's that juxtaposition of love and hate again. Capulet's parenting is criminally abusive. There's no better term for it. Told by his wife that Juliet has rejected his plan for her to marry Paris, he bombards his daughter with a torrent of terrifying oaths and degrading curses. It is abundantly clear that he is not prepared to be interrupted or contradicted. He spits, "Speak not, reply not, do not answer me. My fingers itch." Note that Capulet's language here has lost its smooth, perfect iambic flow. There is a caesura in line 163, a natural pause or break in the line of poetry, usually near the middle of the line, to reflect Capulet allowing the effect of his affret of violence, his fingers are itching to act, to sink in, or possibly giving him a split second to compose himself, to change tack. He also uses asyndeton when he blusters, "Speak not, reply not, do not answer me." And the effect of this is to confirm the audience's opinion that he is a parent out of control. A parent who is breathlessly issuing curse after curse without any sense of proportion or rationality. A parent who, rather than lose face, declares he would prefer his daughter to hang, beg, starve, die in the streets. And note once again the absence of conjunctions, this time in the use of brachylogia, emphasising the relentlessness of his paranoid fury. So Shakespeare presents conflict between parents and children, between the older generation and the younger. Principally, this is seen in the dynamics between Capulet and Juliet, but it should be noted that Juliet's mother, although not resorting to the same level of violent threat, is ultimately on the side of her husband in the battle, as confirmed by her hope-crushing departing couplet in Act 3, Scene 5. "Talk not to me, for I'll not speak a word. Do as thou wilt, for I have done with thee." And the consequence of this conflict in Romeo and Juliet is first deception and ultimately tragic death. I'd now like to move on to the play's presentation and exploration of religion. Unlike some other Shakespearean tragedies, King Lear, Macbeth for example, the world of Romeo and Juliet is indeed a Christian one, albeit not the Protestantism of Elizabethan England, but the Catholicism of Italy. On a language level, religious images are used regularly to give greater weight and gravitas to Romeo and Juliet's feelings for each other. During the couple's first meeting in Act 1, Scene 5, Romeo's opening words to Juliet are, "If I profane with my unworthiest hand this holy shrine, the gentle fine is this. My lips to blushing pilgrims ready stand to smooth that rough touch with a tender kiss." These lines contain three explicitly religious terms. The verb profane, meaning showing no respect for a god or a religion, often through language. Shrine, a place for worship that is holy because of a connection with a holy person or object. And pilgrims, people who make a journey, often a long and difficult one, to a special place for religious reasons. Essentially, Romeo is repeatedly and figuratively calling Juliet sacred. By taking her hand, he recognises that this could be interpreted as profaning or showing insufficient respect because, in his words, she is a holy shrine, a symbol of religious beauty. Pilgrims travel to shrines to worship, and Romeo's third and fourth lines on screen see him cleverly suggesting that his lips are effectively Juliet worshippers, which could potentially make up for the rough touch of his hands with a devoted kiss. The more cynical might say that what Romeo is doing here is using religious imagery to flatter, to butter up Juliet's ego, in order to help him get into a position where she might contemplate a sexual relationship with him. A girl is always likely to respond better to advances which implicitly praise. However, an alternative interpretation is that Romeo is genuinely spiritually moved at the sight of Juliet, and is using religious imagery to help him express deeply held emotions which he hasn't accessed previously. The fact that Juliet is able to respond using the same religious imagery, and that the pair are able to seamlessly, smoothly alternate sections and lines from an iambic pentameter sonnet, may indeed suggest that the more optimistic interpretation is correct. These two are in the process of developing an extraordinary spiritual connection, otherwise known as love. But of course, just because the tragic hero of a play calls his 13-year-old heroine a holy shrine or a dear saint, doesn't make either of them particularly religious, just familiar with and able to manipulate religious terminology for their own purposes. And throughout the play, there are instances in which the language, rites and people connected to religion seem to be used in order to further human desires and emotions, rather than to develop a closer relationship with God, which you could argue should be the main purpose. For instance, in Act 2, Scene 4, Romeo tells the nurse that Juliet should ask her parents for permission to go to confession or shrift at Friar Lawrence's cell. This deceit will enable the pair to be married secretly instead. Similarly, in Act 3, Scene 5, faced with thundering pressure from parents to marry Paris, already married to Romeo and Juliet, uses the same device in order to obtain advice from Friar Lawrence, but with the added detail that this visit is principally motivated by her recognition of the sin of offending her father. So the presence of religious institutions, particularly those led by arguably unscrupulous friars, acts as a facilitator for deceit and parental disobedience. And what about the main religious figure in the play? What do his character and behaviour reveal about religion and religious belief? Well, although he does lace his exchanges with conventional religious exclamations and has an appropriately reverent attitude towards marriage, Friar Lawrence's role in the play seems far more to act as a pander than as a devoted man of God. It is he who agrees to marry the foolish teenagers. It is he who reassures a distraught, just banished Romeo to voyeuristically ensure the marriage is consummated. And it is he who comes up with a cack-handed, doomed to end in disaster, sleeping potion plot. He becomes central to the future of Romeo and Juliet's whole relationship. At the end of Act 3, Scene 5, Juliet's words suggest that her very life is dependent on him. Shakespeare's presentation of the friar, thus, is unquestionably ambivalent. On the one hand, the man of God seems to be trying to do the right thing. Justifying his decision to agree to marry Romeo and Juliet, he professes, naively, that this alliance may so happy prove to turn your household's rancour to pure love. So his hope is that the marriage between the pair would act as a magic wand. Hey presto, the enmity between two families which in the past has caused 3 mass brawls and even propelled old men to reach for their weapons will come to an earth-shuddering halt due to a secret marriage between 2 teenagers, neither of whom have had the courtesy to ask for their parents' views, let alone permission. Yet he seems to be well-meaning, this friar, and certainly has a good reputation within Verona. In Act 4, Scene 2, Capulet praises him heartily, crying, "Now afore God, this reverend holy friar, our whole city is much bound to him." However, Capulet's lavish praise is undermined by the fact that Friar Lawrence is going behind his back to deceive him. Indeed, if Capulet knew the truth, in other words, that Friar Lawrence not only married Juliet without his permission or knowledge, but was also about to concoct an elaborate plot in which he will be fooled into thinking his daughter is dead, his opinion would rapidly change. 4. Under the guise of acting for the best, isn't there a sense that Friar Lawrence seems rather too ready to deceive or devise elaborate deceptions for a trusted man of God? And in Act 4, Scene 5, when faced with the supposedly dead Juliet, doesn't his implicitly lying, glib statement that Juliet is in a better place, i.e. heaven, come a little too easily? Is this a genuine Christian, or someone who, like Romeo, like Juliet, is all too prepared to use religious language and notions in order to further his own ambitions, in this case to protect himself from accusations of impropriety? And what about his extraordinary suggestion to Juliet, faced with a self-poisoned Romeo, that he could dispose of thee among a sisterhood of holy nuns? Why on earth would Juliet, having now begun to experience a little of what the adult world outside her home has to offer, want to renounce it all, even if it may just be for a temporary period? This proposal seems the perfect cowardly convenient means for Friar Lawrence to silence Juliet and get her out of the way, in case of future awkward questions from the prince and others. And this impression of Friar Lawrence as a coward is furthered a few lines later in Act 5, Scene 3, when, hearing people arriving, he leaves Juliet effectively to kill herself within the Capulet tomb, declaring that he dare no longer stay. Perhaps beneath the references to Holy St. Francis and Jesu Maria lies a man who is ultimately only interested in himself and his own safety. In no way does he represent the values of charity and self-sacrifice found in the New Testament of the Bible. To some, but not all, extent, this ambivalent presentation can be put down to Elizabethan Protestant suspicions of Catholicism. to return to the Cambridge Study Guide for further insight into the context. Many Elizabethans saw in Friar Lawrence their stereotype of the scheming Italian priest. Their jaundiced preconception would be confirmed by his actions, most obviously the way he readily breaks church law in secretly conducting the marriage of a 13-year-old girl, and then deceives her parents with a dangerous plan of his own devising. Thus, the setting of the play in Verona, rather than England, ensures that negative interpretations of the ambiguous figure of Friar Lawrence cannot be said to be a direct criticism of Protestantism, but rather a splendid opportunity to feel superior to foreigners. So Shakespeare's presentation of religion and religious figures is ambivalent. The play abounds with religious imagery, but this is consistently used for non-religious purposes, i.e. to stress the specialness of certain human relationships. In terms of the religious figure, initially he seems kind and loving, albeit rather weird with his dabbling in botanical extracts. But by the end it is clear to the audience that his meddling has played a huge role in causing death and devastation. Next theme to probe and ponder: fate. It is surely impossible to spend time thinking about Romeo and Juliet without at some point having to address this key question. To what extent are these young lovers in control of their destiny? Are they, to quote an understandably pessimistic Gloucester from Shakespeare's tragedy King Lear, simply as flies to wanton boys are we to the gods, they kill us for their sport? Or do they have some control over what happens to them in their lives, and simply end up dead due to factors that were within human control? Poor communication, for example, and/or dubious decision-making. Well, the prologue, which unsportingly gives away the whole plot, famously states that Romeo and Juliet are a pair of star-crossed lovers who take their life. This implies that they are destined through fate to kill themselves tragically. Certainly Romeo in particular regularly seems to suggest that he believes his fate is out of his hands. In the scene before the gala Capulet ball, he tells his highest spirited friends Mercutio and Benvolio that he has a bad feeling. I fear too early, for my mind misgives some consequence yet hanging in the stars shall bitterly begin his fearful date with this night's revels, and expire the term of a despised life closed in my breast by some vile forfeit of untimely death. But he that hath the steerage of my course direct my sail. So Romeo has a premonition that something of terrible consequence will begin that evening, something which will result in his early untimely death. But in spite of this premonition, Romeo effectively says, "Oh well, let's get on with things anyway. Carry on, fate, with directing my life." It is difficult to know exactly how to take these lines. On the one hand, you could argue that if Romeo felt utter conviction that attending the Capulet party as an uninvited guest would end in tragic death, then surely he could have chosen to walk away and thus stick two fingers up at the unkind god steering his personal ship. Alternatively, if you do genuinely believe that we have a predetermined destiny, then ultimately what is pre-planned to happen will happen at some point, irrespective of trivial human decisions about whether or not to attend a particular party. And other later lines in the party do emphasise Romeo's puzzling to a modern audience passivity. In Act 3, Scene 1, following Mercutio's, then Tybalt's death, Romeo describes himself, rather conveniently, as being Fortune's fool. This personification of fortune as an all-powerful non-human force who can use human beings as playthings or fools emphasises that Romeo feels that however hard he tries to do the right thing, fate is going to conspire against him. In this particular scene, Act 3, Scene 1, he may have a point. Firstly, he was politeness personified to a taunting, deeply unpleasant Tybalt. Yet, a fight still broke out. Secondly, he tried to break up the fight, but only caused the accidental death of his best friend. Tybalt, due to Romeo's intervention, is unable to see exactly where he is thrusting and ends up plunging his rapier straight into Mercutio's heart. And finally, he temporarily loses control when wild with grief and rage due to Mercutio's death. In the subsequent fight, he kills Tybalt before any outraged officers or citizens can intervene to halt the proceedings. As the play enters its closing stages, Romeo mentally switches from being passively accepting of his powerlessness in the hands of fate to an attitude of defiance. In Act 5, Scene 1, hearing incorrectly that Juliet is dead, he cries, "Is it even so? Then I defy you, stars!" He then asks his servant to hire him horses so that he can forcefully take matters into his own human hands by going to Juliet and killing himself so that they can be together in death. This attitude of recklessness, this need to feel that he is finally exerting some belated control over key events in his life, is confirmed in the seconds before he drinks the apothecary's poison. In his parting lines, he declares that, "Oh, here will I set up my everlasting rest and shake the yoke of inauspicious stars from this world-wearied flesh." A yoke is a wooden bar that is fastened over the necks of two animals, especially cattle, and connected to the vehicle or load that they are pulling. Romeo's metaphorical use of the term here conjures up the image of human beings humiliatingly crouched on all fours with a bar over their neck, connected to a personified ruthless figure of fate or stars. The implication is that human beings are simply driven, cattle-like, towards whatever end fate has in store for us. The tragic irony is that the only way Romeo feels he can escape this oppression is by going to some difficulties, risking human retribution by returning to Verona, having to break into a sealed tomb, in ending his life altogether whilst next to Juliet. But of course, by killing himself, is Romeo actually defiantly throwing off fate's chains of bondage, or simply continuing to follow the path that has been pre-allocated to him? Certainly he feels a kind of defiant relief that he has now assigned himself a degree of control over proceedings. Nonetheless, the fact that his actions are based on a misunderstanding, Juliet has been put inside the tomb within her living death for his and her own longer-term benefit, reinforces the audience's impression that the pair's relationship was doomed from the very beginning. Whether this was due to fate or just a desperately unlucky sequence of events, including that the pair didn't realise that they were from enemy families before falling in love, Romeo unwittingly killing Tybalt, Friar John not being able to deliver the all-important letter to Romeo due to being housebound following concerns about the plague spreading, Juliet's sleeping drug wearing off minutes after Romeo has already killed himself, will depend on your own personal beliefs about predestination. Either way, the net result is compelling tragic drama. We know, indeed we are told, that the pair are going to die. What is compelling is watching and suffering with them as they near their pre-allocated doom. In the final section of this mammoth video, I'm going to talk you through a model answer that I've written to an AQA exam question. How does this meet the requirements of the mark scheme? The question is this: explore how Shakespeare presents aggressive male behaviour in Romeo and Juliet. The extract is from the opening scene of the play. Here's my response. In this extract, Shakespeare suggests that aggressive men enjoy littering their language with boasts and taunts about their sexual prowess. The extract begins with Samson, a servant from the Capulet household, crying, "My naked weapon is out." On a literal level, this refers to his sword having been unsheathed, suggesting that he is primed and ready to inflict violence. However, the adjective naked is used far more typically to refer to a human being's lack of clothing. In Shakespeare's King Lear, for example, the king, when referring compassionately to the plight of homeless beggars, calls them poor naked wretches. This adjective, combined with a metaphorical use of the noun weapon, is clearly intended to express misplaced, jubilant male pride in Samson's manhood. The implication of this, and earlier similar references, such as the same man declaring that he will thrust his maids to the wall, is that proclaiming confidence in your own manliness is a key component in the manifestation of aggressive male behaviour. This extract also suggests that apparently innocuous, at least to a modern audience, gestures can be sufficient to cause widespread violence on the streets of Verona. Samson says explicitly that biting his thumb at members of the Montague household is a disgrace to them if they bear it, and this is confirmed by the outraged repetition of "bite my" or "your" thumb throughout the extract. Abraham, presumably the more aggressive Montague servant, based on his counterpart Balthazar's lack of speech, asks twice, "Do you bite your thumb at us, sir?" The tone of this direct question is clearly aggressive and challenging. It is showing Samson that he is prepared to tackle his mocking gesture head on. What is particularly notable within this exchange is the absence of any pleasantries or any preliminary words. Having seen a member of their enemy's household jerk his thumbnail forward from the front teeth, the immediate step is to challenge, and challenge aggressively. The implication of this, confirmed by the prince's later furious reference to 3 civil brawls bred of an airy word, is that male aggressive behaviour is a relatively normal, regular occurrence within Verona, and that little is required to ignite it. That said, the exchange between Samson and Gregory does indicate that the men recognise the importance of some caution before starting mass brawls. On 2 occasions, Samson refers to "law of our sides." Although he is clearly keen to fight and release testosterone, these references suggest that, at least in terms of the law, he would prefer the fighting to have technically been triggered not by himself, as a somewhat half-hearted attempt to reduce culpability later on. Hence, when Gregory confirms that if he agrees that he is biting his thumb directly at Abraham, he is likely to be held responsible by the law, Samson comes out with the equivocating line, "No, sir, I do not bite my thumb at you, sir, but I bite my thumb, sir." So although this equivocating technically means Samson can try to claim that he wasn't responsible for any violence that might have erupted, it remains clear that his overall desire is to taunt and provoke. The thumb-flicking gesture would only be used to defy people other than yourself, and there is no one else present on stage apart from Abraham and Balthazar. In this extract, Shakespeare shows that aggressive males are hell-bent on violence, and the fact that the dispute is between their masters rather than themselves, and that the servants know there will be some legal consequences, is of comparatively little importance. Indeed, in the play as a whole, Shakespeare suggests that it is almost impossible to escape involvement in violence if you are a Capulet or a Montague. In Act 3, Scene 1, for instance, Romeo, newly enamoured with Juliet, attempts to conciliate a particularly fiery member of the Capulet household, Tybalt. Following the latter's command for him to turn and draw, and the seriousness of this command is emphasised by the failure to include any silly sexual puns, as the servants were so keen to do at the beginning of the play, Romeo responds, "I do protest I never injured thee, but love thee better than thou canst desise." In this context, Romeo's use of the second personal pronouns thou and thee are intended to indicate friendship and intimacy, and show that he has refused to rise to the bait of Tybalt's preceding use of the insulting labels of villain and boy. The first term of villain would have been particularly insulting during Shakespeare's time, as it would not just have had associations with illegal and immoral behaviour, as is the case nowadays, but also that the addressee was extremely lowborn, a peasant, a terrible insult to someone of a noble family within Shakespeare's rigidly hierarchical society. Nonetheless, in spite of Romeo's best efforts to placate, violence ensues, initially because Mercutio is so outraged on Romeo's behalf at Tybalt's taunts. In the ensuing melee, Mercutio is accidentally killed, which causes Romeo to erupt into rage and reignite his laid dormant by love male aggression. Thus it could be argued that it is a combination of male aggression and bad luck, amongst other factors, which result in the terrible tragedies of the final few acts of the play. But aggressive male behaviour isn't just seen in violence between similarly aged men from publicly opposed families. It is also shown between elder generations within families, in which the older family figure uses verbal aggression in an ultimately futile desire to control. In Act 1, Scene 5, Tybalt's insistence on gaining instant revenge on Romeo for gate-crashing their party eventually results in his uncle Capulet erupting furiously. Capulet rails, "Am I the master here, or you? Go to! You'll not endure him. God shall mend my soul. You're making mutiny among my guests." His language drips with ferocious aggression, as seen particularly in the imperative within the dramatic short sentence, "Go to," and the disbelieving rhetorical question emphasising who should have ultimate authority at such an event. However, it is in Act 3, Scene 5 in which Capulet's aggression is most shocking. Faced with his daughter seemingly refusing to follow his instructions that she should marry Paris, he launches into an astonishing tirade, which to a modern audience would unquestionably constitute abuse. "I will drag thee on a hurdle to church. Out, you green sickness carrion. Out, you baggage, you tallow face." The fact that the largely docile Lady Capulet follows these words with "Fie, fie, what, are you mad?" illustrates that even for an Elizabethan audience, these words are unacceptable. A hurdle was a wooden frame on which traitors were dragged through the streets to execution. Whilst we must presume that even Capulet is speaking metaphorically and doesn't plan to carry this through, this insult nevertheless degrades his daughter to the level of a condemned common criminal who has plotted to overthrow the monarch. His subsequent exclamations label her as the decaying flesh of dead animals, carrion. And overall, the effect of his verbal aggression is to utterly terrify a daughter whom, up to this point in the play, has come across as obedient and submissive, telling her mother in Act 1, Scene 3, "No more deep will I endart mine eye than your consent gives strength to make it fly." Nonetheless, it is important to emphasise the context and how attitudes have evolved. In Shakespeare's time, women would legally and morally have been seen as the property of men. To many people in Shakespeare's audience, the concept of a daughter defying her father would have been deeply shocking, even in relation to a decision which will impact upon the daughter's future as much as finding an appropriate husband. By looking at other Shakespeare plays, it quickly becomes apparent that verbal aggression from fathers towards disobedient daughters was not unusual. In King Lear, for example, the king disinherits his previously favourite daughter Cordelia after she refuses to publicly proclaim her devotion. His language to her is perhaps slightly more restrained than Capulet's, if only due to his awareness of his own regal status. Nonetheless, following just one incident of apparent disobedience, he declares, "We have no such daughter, nor shall ever see that face of hers again." However, in both plays, fatherly aggression towards their daughters is shown to have long-term destructive consequences. In King Lear, the aged, doting father loses his only ally, and for a period of time, his sanity. Whilst in Romeo and Juliet, the ultimate consequences of Capulet aggressively insisting on a ridiculously fast marriage are the death of Juliet, Paris and Romeo, following the failure of the Friar Lawrence inspired feigned death potion plan. To sum up, Shakespeare shows that aggressive male behaviour frequently includes insecure, implicit boats of virility, becomes almost impossible to avoid within the Capulet-Montagu households, and ultimately results in unnecessary tragic deaths. Now, yes, this response is probably too long. In fact, it is too long, and any of us would struggle to write as much as that within the 50 minutes or so allocated within the exam. But I hope it gives you an indication of the level of organisation and insight needed to obtain the highest marks. Let's pick up on some details. Note in the very first sentence, I aim to precisely answer the question. When I write, in this extract, Shakespeare suggests that aggressive men enjoy littering their language with boasts and taunts about their sexual prowess. The top band of Assessment Objective 1 requires a critical, exploratory, conceptualised response to task. And this is what I am aiming to address immediately by using keywords from the question within my first sentence: Shakespeare and aggressive men or male. Notice also that I'm keen to show off immediately how well and how precisely I can write. Markers have so many tedious, frequently formulaic scripts to wade through. I'm trying to move away from that with the use of the more flamboyant phrase, enjoy littering their language. The top band of Assessment Objective 1 also requires judicious use of precise references to support interpretation. Don't make your quotations too long. My initial quotation is just 5 words, but this is sufficient to help me make 2 points about the language. Firstly, I talk about the literal meaning of the phrase naked weapon, before, in a different sentence to aid clarity, talking about the sexual connotations. This analysis of language meets the second assessment objective: analysis of writers' methods with subject terminology used judiciously, exploration of effects of writers' methods on reader. I know that naked is an adjective, so I use this term rather than the generic word. This is a basic example of subject terminology. Other examples of subject terminology later in the essay include terms such as metaphorical, second-person pronouns, and rhetorical question. When analysing language, I continually try to give as much insight as possible. For example, when exploring the question, do you bite your thumb at us, sir? I try to A. Specify the tone. It is clearly aggressive and challenging. B. Comment on the unexpected directness of the question. There are no prior pleasantries or preliminary words. Abraham just asked the question straight off. C. Show that I understand exactly what the phrase means, i.e., it is when you jerk a thumbnail forward from the front teeth. Note also that I don't begin every sentence with, this suggests that, or this shows that. One sentence begins with, what is particularly notable within. This variety within my sentence openers adds to the overall impression that I understand not just the nuances of literature and Shakespeare, but also that I enjoy writing about it. Finally, Assessment Objective 3. Exploration of ideas, perspective, contextual factors shown by specific, detailed links between context, text, task. I do this in a number of different ways within the essay. One example is when I explained how the word villain has evolved. I write, the first term of villain would have been particularly insulting during Shakespeare's time, as it would not just have had associations with illegal and immoral behaviour, as is the case nowadays, but also that the addressee was extremely low-born, a peasant, a terrible insult to someone of a noble family within Shakespeare's rigidly hierarchical society. I also aim to contextualise Capulet's terrible behaviour by pointing out that in Shakespeare's time, women would legally and morally have been seen as the property of men. To many people in Shakespeare's audience, the concept of a daughter defying her father would have been deeply shocking, even in relation to a decision which will impact upon the daughter's future as much as finding an appropriate husband. This video is dragged on enough. I hope it's been helpful. Many thanks for watching.